next week. But today, we begin with trying to understand what deconstruction is all about. So what is deconstruction? Deconstruction is the act or practice of breaking something down into constituent parts. So, what does that involve? It will involve dissecting, dismantling, unraveling, explicating. So what is the origin of the term deconstruction? In the 1960s, a French philosopher named Jacques Derrida began to advocate for a postmodern philosophy of language and its relationship to our conceptions of meaning that he called deconstruction. So that's the definition of the secular meaning of deconstruction, and in relation to re-examining our culture and civilization. What about religious deconstruction? Well, it's a process during which religious believers re-examine their beliefs. During deconstruction, people question their beliefs. So we will question our beliefs, identity, and practices. They may struggle and experience anxiety. Some eventually modify their beliefs into something more satisfactory to them. So for sure there are negative results from religious deconstruction, and one of them is what we call de-identification. Religious de-identification is a reduction in religious identity or religious beliefs. That's a psychological definition. So what has happened is evangelical Protestants have declined from 27% of adults in 2007 to 23% in 2025. This is a decline from 33% of the US populations in 1999 were evangelical Protestants. And now it's only, last year it's only 23%. Last year, the Catholic Church showed an increase in membership. So something is happening. Most people who leave evangelical Protestant churches, whether they like it or not, conscious or not, they go to deconstruction of their beliefs. That's why they left the church. So what happens during religious de-identification? There's disbelief in core tenets of religion. And most of the time, if you're not careful in the process, the people who go through de-identification become atheists or agnostic. Then there's disengagement from emotional connection to the spiritual or divine. They stop believing in spiritual things. That's the engagement. Then there's discontinuance of religious rules. For example, they used to follow dietary rules. Well, they no longer follow dietary rules. They'll eat anything they want. And of course, there were use of alcohol, sex life. These are all, dictated by religion. Once they discontinue religious rules, they're no longer bound by them. And then, of course, there's disaffiliation from religious social communities. They stop attending church. They remove their membership or connection to their church. So those are the definitions. So today, session 1, we will discuss our need for deconstruction. Why do we need deconstruction? While the Bible does not use the word deconstruction, it speaks clearly about examining our faith and testing ourselves. In 2 Corinthians 13:5, Paul says, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. So here, the process is not to get out of the faith. Okay? The process to make sure we have real faith. So, this we call Christian deconstruction. Christian deconstruction is the process by which a Christian critically reevaluates, okay, the tenets and doctrines of traditional Christianity and emerges with a different perspective in their faith. So, what are the reasons why people go through deconstruction? Why Christians deconstruct? Number one, there is a decline in the people's trust of large institutions. Large institutions that we deal with that affect our culture, affect our behavior, affect our lifestyle is our church, that's the immediate one, our family, our church, and then the government and whoever, you know. There's a decline. And the second reason is we now live in a different society, more diverse, accessible, and mobile. For the better part of world history, most people didn't have to worry about having their faith tested by alternative truth claims. What do I mean by this? In other words, when we were growing up in your old religion, you didn't worry about the other religion. They're just plain wrong. So you didn't listen to them or even hear them out. In fact, you didn't know anything about what they believe, but they're just wrong. That's in the old days. You simply live and died within the religious system you were born to. We no longer live in that world. Globalization, immigration, and international travel provide the dizzying array of opportunities to encounter and befriend people of different cultures, lifestyles, and religious backgrounds. And we discover that they're good people. Now, because of interaction, you discover many times that they're better than you, better than most people in your church. So, you know, that's the reason why you begin to question your church beliefs, where you grow, because you see people who don't belong to your church, they have better lives than the people in your church. So, and like the printing press during the Reformation, the advent of the internet, social media opened the doors to a multitude of voices, perspectives, and experiences that you were not exposed to before. We live in a different world. Every day someone is posting something on Facebook. Someone is sending you on Messenger, you know, on YouTube. So, according to author Gregory Boyd, he said, it's much easier to remain certain of your beliefs when you are not in personal contact with people who believe differently. If you grow in an environment everybody's the same, we used to joke about Loma Linda having a population of 144,000. That's in the old days. They had the post offices closed on Saturdays. But when you encounter people with different beliefs, when those people's sincerity and devotion possibly put yours to shame, things become quite a bit more difficult. So you begin to challenge your own belief, what your church taught you, your cultural background. And third, burnout of the strongest and most active Christians. Most of the people who go to deconstruction were the most active leaders of the church, active, working, hardly hearing the sermon. They're always working. Ever been to Saddleback? There's people directing you from the parking lot to the place, and I wonder if they ever hear the sermons. And that's every week. 3 services a day. You know, how do you, and they get burned out. And they say, is it worth all my trouble? I hardly have time for myself, my family. So you begin to look at your own beliefs. That's why it forces you to deconstruct. Many of the people who'd left the church were once considered some of the strongest and most active members. That's a great loss. It's people who didn't really have solid foundation, but were very active and contributed to the maintenance and outreach of the church, are the first ones to say, is this worth it? 38%, that's a lot, of church leaders have considered leaving ministry in the past year alone. That's almost 40% leaders. And number 4, opposition against the prioritization of tribal identity over unity. Okay. For many young people, ambiguity, curiosity, and mystery are essential components of their faith journey. They ask questions. Today's generation of young people don't just accept what you tell them. They ask questions. Unfortunately, many faith communities narrow the discipleship path to a rigid set of doctrinal stances that doubles as a source of tribal identity and pride. What do we mean? Well, some churches are very strict in what the young people are reading or learning, okay? And they protect their doctrines, their doctrinal beliefs. And they tell the young people, our doctrines are the only true ones. Anything opposed to this is false. So that becomes their identity and pride. You know that. If you come from a denomination that feels they're the remnant church, everyone will unite to persecute us. That becomes your identity. And anyone who doesn't belong to your group, you see them as future enemy. because we have a prophecy that says in the last days, before Jesus comes, there's going to be the time of trouble. And all the Protestant church will unite with the Catholic Church and the United States government to form one government to persecute our denomination. So that becomes your identity. And anything not belonging to your group is a potential persecutor or enemy. So you're kind of careful associating with people like that. So they eat different food, you don't eat the same food. They have different activities which you can't participate in. So that locks you in. You have a tribal identity and pride that prevents you from really learning the bigger truth outside of your church. There's a bigger truth. There's not only your church. So here's a test. If everyone in your church is expected to look, talk, and think and believe exactly like you, your church isn't as welcoming as you assume. That's why we became Church Without Walls. Instead, you created a church culture that sacrifices unity for conformity. Okay? 5, the Christian community's acceptance of political idolatry and conspiracy theories. This, especially a lot of young people today, are beginning to not put up with what's happening in the mainstream churches. Eh? Their acceptance of political idolatry. What is political idolatry? It's not a coincidence that deconstruction became more mainstream during one of the politically tumultuous eras of modern history. And it's telling that none of the recent hot takes critical of deconstruction have acknowledged hyper-political partisanship within the church, even though that's the most common complaint of people who are deconstructing. So it's too much politics now. Church is identifying with one political party, and it's getting worse. You only view one channel for news, and now everyone is really locked in to a certain belief, and you don't hear the wider truth. You're not exposed to the wider truth. Purpose of deconstruction is to tell you that the truth you believe is not the only truth. There's a bigger truth outside of what we believe. That's why you deconstruct. Okay? Here's a comment from Amy Peterson from the book Where Goodness Still Grows. People of my generation aren't leaving the church because their devious atheist professors got to them, but because they saw a church more interested in defending political power than in loving their neighbors. Here's Timothy Keller, who wrote a book about Christian deconstruction for the New York Times. While believers can register under a party affiliation and be active in politics, there's nothing wrong with that. They should not identify the Christian church or faith with the political party as the only Christian one. Okay? Another related concern is the virulent spread and widespread acceptance of conspiracy theories in Christian communities. When we say conspiracy theories, it's just made up in the internet. We don't know where it came from, but it became widespread within a certain group. And everyone believes that. Remember, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories about the Epstein files, you know, and still we still don't have the whole truth. But what happening is Christian communities begin to believe more about these conspiracies without the basis of proof. According to a 2021 PRRI survey, 1 in 4 Protestant Christians, 1 in 4, that's 25%, in the U.S. agreed with the statement. Look at this statement. The government, media, and financial worlds in the U.S. are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. 25% of Christians believe that. The government is run by Satan-worshipping pedophiles. And here's another thing. Christians were twice as likely to fall for conspiracy theories spread on social media than those who consider themselves religiously unaffiliated. In other words, the secular people were less prone to believe those theories when you see them on Facebook or YouTube. Here's a recent MIT technology review. 19 of the top 20 Christian Facebook pages, 19, the top Christian Facebook pages, were run by Eastern European troll farms and Russian operatives, intentionally targeting U.S. Christians via Facebook ads to spread misinformation and sow division during election season. Watch out. That's almost all of the Christian Facebook. 19 out of 20 is run by Russians and Eastern Europeans to convince Christians that they're a Christian group. But what they're saying is misinformation. And this was also a problem in the Philippines, you know, during the election when Duterte was elected. Maria Ressa, who won the Peace Prize, complained about that to what's his name, who owns Facebook at that, you know, what is it now called, Facebook? Meta. And he said he couldn't do anything. They should mark those groups who are not legitimately individuals or groups that will give you the truth. They're just sowing misinformation, and ban them, but they won't do it. So you can't rely. Anybody post something on Facebook, you know, if you don't know what it is, delete it from your account. Otherwise, all your friends might believe that and spread it. See, this is what's happening, and that's why a lot of people do not trust church anymore, because most of the members tend to believe these things, and it spreads within that community. So the biggest argument against Christian deconstruction is deconstruction itself. It's risky. There's no limit on how far you can go. And you can easily come out the other side a lonely and bitter person with no hope to offer to the world or yourself. If the path you're on isn't making you more generous, is the test, compassionate, hopeful and merciful person, or in other words, more like Jesus, then the destination isn't worth the journey. If all you're reading about, passing on information, is about hating your neighbor, deporting all the foreigners, including yourself, that your destination isn't worth the journey. Change your destination. Make no mistake, there are things within our Christian culture that need to be challenged and evaluated. But a Christ-honoring deconstruction revels in truth and beauty, not cynicism and arrogance. So here's the key distinctive of Christian deconstruction. Biblical self-examination drives us back to Christ and His Word, while cultural deconstruction often drives people away from Him. Be careful. Even our government leaders are quoting things from the Bible that aren't from the Bible. So just be careful. All we're saying is deconstruct everything that you see. Test everything before you believe and share it. It's so easy to, you like how it sounds and you just share it. No, you don't know where that thing came from. Christian deconstruction must lead us to metanoia, a change in our way of thinking. It shouldn't just be a negative experience where you start doubting God, and turning your back on all you've learned even from your church. So metanoia is the Greek word translated into English as repentance. And because of that, it's been causing all kinds of misunderstanding. Repentance actually means deep sorrow, compunction, or contrition for a past sin, wrongdoing, or the like. You need that when you're confessing to the priest. You need to repent. You don't get blessed if there's no repentance. Usually understood as a regret for any past action. That is not the real meaning of metanoia. The original meaning of metanoia is to change our mind or way of thinking. Deconstruction without reconstruction is a tragedy. You don't just tear apart the house and just leave it torn apart. You tear it apart to know what shouldn't belong there and there's reconstruction. Put it all back. That's why we will have guidelines next week on how to judge whether this belongs in your house or not. According to Tony Hefner, the latest book in relational theology or deconstruction, he just released it this year. He says, a relationship with God can sometimes lead us to logical contradictions. What does that mean? A relationship with God can sometimes lead us to logical contradiction, requiring us to make philosophical concessions in our theology. Embracing a more robust relationship with God and each other will require a new way of thinking. In other words, a true relationship with God, every step of the way, is going to challenge your personal beliefs, your personal behavior and outlook. Every step of the way, you're going to be challenged. Because God wants us to change our way of thinking. And if our way of thinking and attitude does not align with Christ's way of thinking, we're going to be challenged. Okay, the re-examination of our faith eventually encounters paradox. Here's the thing that most people don't really understand, that there's always paradox in what we believe and what we understand. Okay, what is paradox? Seeming to define reason, paradox is a self-contradiction within a single concept. In other words, within a single concept, two things that can't be both simultaneously true and yet held to be so. So we'll find examples. You know, we've held paradoxical beliefs. They're opposing and yet it's supposed to be true. Logically, it can. So when our God talk is confronted by paradox, we may experience anxiety and be led to reject our paradoxical idea. Once you start examining your own held beliefs, you will see some paradox in it. In other words, two conflicting ideas held to be both true. And now you're questioning which one is really correct. Which one should I give up? Instead of being confused and confounded, we allow for both contradictory propositions to be true. So that's the challenge. When we deconstruct, we filter out or reject what we feel conflicts with a healthy relationship or conflicts with the real-world experience. This sifting of concepts is our deconstruction. In other words, when you are taught that everyone who doesn't belong to your church is going to hell, and you believe that to be true, you're going to be challenged because you see your friend who's loving and helps more people than you and most people in your church. This guy is going to hell. Now, if that is true, then you begin to question God's justice, God's love. It opens a door of God being not really good. He's sending my friend to hell, who's really a good person, who's following Jesus' teachings, but he just doesn't belong to my church. Well, so that's why we need to go to deconstruction, because we tend to have attitudes like that. And it's hard to get rid of, because you were brought up in a subculture that made you believe that anyone who doesn't belong to your subcultural group, is going to hell, no matter how good he is, because he just doesn't belong. But reconstruction can be difficult. And I mean, putting it all together, you break it apart, it can be difficult. Meaning-giving entities, such as a family or a church, seldom give their members the tools needed to rethink the version of reality, the worldview that has been taught. Thus, it may seem an intimidating task to reconstruct a meaningful concept of ourselves, much less the concept of God. So, when we look at theology is much more than what we don't believe. Many who were raised in an exclusive church, who includes, people who don't belong, are excluded from God's family. You define your theology by what you don't believe. Like if you associate, you're invited to go to a party. Here's some food. I can't eat that because of my religion. Yeah. Your religion is now defined by the don'ts. I can't dance, I can't drink. Well, what kind of religion do you have? Theology is about God, not about rules. So if your theology is about rules, then there's something that needs to be deconstructed, because theology is the study or what we know about God. The practical theology is about what we do believe, and it says a lot about who we are. So reconstructive is creative, it's not destructive. It's a process we are open to God's inspiration. So we should not shrink from this work, for it is here in this creative process that we move toward enlightenment, toward knowing God. Reconstruction should be a relational approach, which after careful discernment is not afraid to embrace paradoxical reality and paradoxical thinking. This type of faith rejects the notion that we can't allow for any doubt. In other words, true reconstruction allows for doubt. Doubt, encourages you to question. And when you question, you learn the bigger truth, not just your own limited truth. You're exposed to a wider truth. The concepts of faith and belief require that there must be the possibility of doubt. You can't just have faith. It's all, remember, two things are true even though they're against each other. Faith and doubt. We always have doubt. We don't just talk about it or we don't want to admit it, but we have doubt. Why do we have doubt? Because we see or what we feel doesn't agree with what we believe. That's why you have doubt. If all you believe agrees with what you see and what you feel, then you won't have any doubt. But you don't have perfect belief. That's why you have doubt. If we never look squarely at doubt and allow it to lead us into paradox, then our faith seems to be more out of whistling in the dark as we pass through a graveyard. I think that sort of believing, the kind that never doubts, is more of a talisman against the things we fear and a balm for our sufferings than it is an honest quest to know God. Have you ever questioned the 6-day creation week in Genesis on the basis of what science knows? I have. That's always in the back of my mind. And that remains unresolved. But I know God is love. But I'm not, it's not going to destroy my faith that the story of the Israelites include the story of how the world was created in 6 days. 6 literal days. That won't bother me because I know science has a different explanation of everything. Someday all of this will make sense. But there's always a doubt. Does God really exist? Does God really know everything? All those omnis, right? You have doubts about that. Does God really know the future? Does God really love people? Why does He allow what He knows in the future will kill or harm a lot of people? So you always have those questions. So don't say that you have no doubts. Humanity is changing. Our ideas about what is right and wrong are evolving. Our ideas about God are evolving as well. Yeah. From culture to culture, there are things that are changing. Where once, almost universal, we have a picture of God as one God, as this way. Now we're saying, why not another way? For the meaning of life that is offered by religion to remain recognizable and relevant, our theology must evolve. So there has to be change. Here's the thing. Orthodox Christianity teaches that there is one correct way of believing. That's orthodox. Your old church made you believe that. It's only one way. Some churches go so far as to teach that their way of worship is the only right way. Remember our worship wars? That every other way is wrong. Even today, you'll see that on YouTube. Don't sing this song from Bethel. Don't sing this song from Hillsong. Why? Traditional Christianity is very much an either-or way of believing. Okay, remember that. This is what is traditional. If you have two conflicting ideas. You have to make a choice. One of them is wrong, either or. So what they're saying is, from the beginning of our journey of deconstruction, we reject this one-way type of believing. We need a way of believing that allows for more than one correct way. Wow. Why? Why should imperfect humans devise one correct way? How did that happen? Did God do that? One correct interpretation? The whole Bible is interpreted. You don't get the Bible without interpretation. First it's translated, and to translate they had to interpret what the original language meant. So, I don't believe in word inspiration because it's interpreted and translated. So there's more than one correct way, and how does it happen? For this, ontological paradox is the answer. Ontology is defined by Webster as a branch of metaphysics concerned with the nature and relations of being. Okay, well, if you don't understand that, that's fine. Hold on till we get to next week because it'll be more practical. When we define our theology, we are concerned with the nature of God and with the way God's nature relates to the universe. We're also trying to develop a lucid description of the way different aspects of God relate to each other. A profound way to make sense of an all-powerful, remember all-powerful, all-knowing God, is to abandon a rhetorically logical way of thinking and realistically consider our paradoxical way. He says abandon the logical way. Okay? Paradox. Webster defines paradox as one person, situation, or action having seemingly contradictory qualities or phases. One thing having seemingly contradictory qualities or phases. What's one example of that? Traditional Orthodox Christian has long held to a paradox in its foundational description of God, the Trinity. Okay? In the Trinitarian paradox, God is one, but at the same time, is three persons, labeled various ways, but the historical depiction is Father, Son, and Spirit. In the Trinity, each of these persons is an individual, yet each is fully God. So, you have one, but three. Both true. Okay? You can't say just either or. So now we have to learn how to think that seemingly contradictory or paradoxical things can be both true. Okay? We learn. It's difficult to think like that. In scientific terms, a paradox is called duality. Stephen Hawking, how many of you remember Stephen Hawking? Yeah. He died already. Yeah. He was in a wheelchair most of the time. He had this machine to enable him to talk. And here's what he discovered: a correspondence between apparently different theories that lead to the same physical results. In other words, there is more than one way, more than one theory leading to the same result. So both are true if they lead to the same result. Okay? Okay. So let's look at what science knows. This is from Stephen Hawking. This is really interesting. Although light is made up of waves, in some ways it behaves as it were composed of particles. So there's two ways light can be. It can be a wave or particles. Not either or. Both are true. It can be emitted or absorbed only in packets or quanta. This is quantum physics now. Equally, particles behave in some respects like waves. There is thus a duality between waves and particles in quantum mechanics. In other words, every element in the universe will behave like particles or waves. Not either or. Both are true. When you have a particle detector, you will see a particle. It's the same thing. When you have a wave detector, you will see a wave. Both are true. That's in physics. That's in science. The wave-particle paradox in the subatomic structure of all matter, has been observed in particles as large as small molecules composed of many atoms. It has been observed that light and all matter at its subatomic level behave as both wave and particle. It's not either or. Both energy and solid matter at the same time. Amazingly, the smallest building block of everything in the universe is literally both related energy and solid particle, until it is observed by a conscious observer. They did this experiment where a single light passes through the slit, and there's a particle identifier. It comes out as particle. Then if it's a wave identifier, it comes out as a wave. So both can be true. So this is the most fascinating part of quantum paradox. It isn't one or the other until we see it as one or the other. All right. Ontological paradox is more than just a logical tool that is useful in debates or sermons. Paradox exists as a foundational reality throughout the universe. Embracing paradox will require us to move from traditional either-or thinking to both-and thinking. So it expands the way you look at truth, at other people, at other groups. It's not just either-or. Both can be true, you know. So as we search for our own significance, we approach it with a paradoxical way of thinking about ourselves in a relationship with a supernatural entity that is God. Most of the time, we imagine that we have a good grasp of reality. We have a worldview that makes sense of what we experience. Based on our culture and church teachings, we have this worldview of either or, okay, either or. Yeah, because logically, we don't believe two things can be true at the same time, especially when they're paradoxical or, you know, against each other. Most of the time, we need to wrestle with the way things are. But occasionally, reality confronts us. What shall we do when our beliefs conflict with the new and different beliefs? Or our faith is contradicted by experience? Our knowledge is challenged by observable reality. When our beliefs, what we know, come into conflict with the world around us, we are likely to encounter anxiety caused by cognitive dissonance. What we know isn't what we observe. So there's cognitive dissonance. Your church taught you this, you know, those who don't believe the same way we do are going to hell. But when you look at your friend who behaves better than you, more Christ-like than you do, then, you know, you have cognitive dissonance. What I learned isn't true. What I know isn't true. It's conflict with the reality that I see. We can then reconsider our belief, possibly modifying our worldview. Or we can deny the conflict, essentially reject the reality that's confronted us. But cognitive dissonance will not be lessened by denying reality. You can't be in denial if there's a real conflict that you see with what you believe and what you experience or see. Only accepting a new way of looking at the world will remove the dissonance and renew our confidence that we know our world. Here's the thing. Humility is required in deconstruction, because our knowledge-reality conflict will indicate that our held beliefs are often wrong. So we need to be humble. Embracing paradox is not easy. Our worldview has functioned well until it didn't. Now we need help to make sense of God or of the world. For that help, we turn to paradox. If indeed both sides of our paradox are true, then we have confidence that there is some unifying concept that brings the two opposing sides together. Our problem is the unity that reconciles our paradox is heretofore unrecognizable, but we are confident it exists. Thus, embracing paradox is an act of humble faith as we broaden our concept of God. I like the word broaden here. It's not really changing, but broaden. There's what we've been limited to saying there's only one way of salvation. There's only one way of doing things. Why not another way? And then we see someone doing it another way. Then we now have conflict or dissonance. So traditional Christianity is exclusive. Traditional is not just our old church, our old religion. Next week we will identify or classify religions and churches into basic stance, not doctrinally or organizationally. And you'll see how similar the Catholic and the SDA Church are. They're very similar. Okay? And then you have all the Protestant churches. They have how many different beliefs that cause a split. And they're not really different from each other. It rejects the possibility that any other religion is correct. That's describe your church. That's traditional Christianity, not just your church. Many people feel that it is very unfair of God, listen to this, to reject so many people, those that aren't Christian. Remember? That's why we need to send missionaries, because they don't become like us, they're going to hell. It seems like tradition is saying of non-believers, if God is going to make a salvation omelette, then God is going to have to break a few eggs. About 5.7 billion now, people who aren't Christians, who don't believe in Christ. So, God is sending them all to hell. Thus, a part of deconstruction of Christianity is to reject exclusivism. Okay? Here's the question. If only one religion is correct, think about this. God's self-revelation is very inefficient or ineffective. It is depending on only one religion to be correct. That's so inefficient and ineffective. In any other system, you will not rely on one way. To be successful, you better have several ways. Because there are several ways people accept what you're selling. If a single God is making God self-known in all religions, then how do we have such different faiths spread across the globe? The answer is the multiplicity of religion and religious sects is due to cultural differences. These differences can be within a local community or might characterize an entire nation. So how do cultural differences result in different religions? We all interpret our experience, any experience, but especially those of God, through a cultural lens, a world view shaped by our culture. That's why we have so many religions. Culture. With this cultural lens in mind, a good analogy for interpreting divine revelation is the way a stained glass window of many colors changes the bright light from the sun into different hues. Only one light from the sun. It goes to the stained glass. The stained glass doesn't change the same light. It's still the same sunlight. But now, it's displayed in different colors, dictated by the color of the glass that same light passed through. Here's the picture.
Yeah.
Same sunlight. The light isn't changed, whether it's particle or waves. But the color is dependent on the lens or the color of the glass, the stained glass that it passes through. So God's truth, the same truth, given to the world, different cultures, it comes out in different colors, but it's the same light. It's hard to accept that our belief isn't the only one truth. The guy who disagrees with me is also, the same light. The window doesn't really change the light, but each piece of colored glass transfers only a small part of the sun's light according to the color of the glass. That's why we have so many religions. Similarly, different cultures respond to the light of revelation differently. So because it's different light, different response. Transferring only the part what has been revealed that is understandable within that culture. So what is accepted by a culture is what is only understandable by that culture. So you don't blame the light, you don't blame the culture, that's just the way it is. That's why there's so many religions. Now, you see, we believe that divine revelation or discovery must be the foundation of true religion. I also think that we err if we too narrowly define what form this supernatural revelation should take. Any meaningful discovery of the divine or any revelatory experience of God has the potential to advance us toward our destiny, even if we fail to recognize God. The light will pass through. When it comes out, it's a different color, but it's still the same light, and you still benefit from it, even if you fail to recognize God. That's hard to accept. You want to make sure they recognize God according to what we teach and what we believe. We don't allow God to take charge of that. We narrow God's ability to reveal himself to people because, especially, we'll learn later on in other cultures how the gospel in the Philippines was preached by the American missionaries. Okay, we'll learn that. Often we allow for some validity in other faiths. We say, okay, the other faiths are okay. And then we search for only those concepts we conceive as compatible with our own faith. Oh yeah, they believe like we do. It seems we can't allow for truth that is different from, much less opposed to our own truth. If we are highly invested in the life meaning provided by our own religion, then exclusivism, the rejection of other faiths, is a natural result. The existence of other faiths threatens our worldview. And that's why there's, for the simple worship style, you will see pastors attacking other pastors because they have a different worship style. Why? How do you know your worship style is the only way to worship God? Now you look in the Old Testament, but you look in the New Testament too. So we still see that today, even today. Why we don't sing Hillsong anymore? Because it's against the way they were taught. Often we defensively sense that we are being judged by another's faith when it's different from our own, and we respond aggressively. That's why when you project exclusivism, the other people that you're talking to will get offended, and they will respond aggressively. This aggression can occasionally manifest as violence, like the Islamic violence towards non-Islamic people. But more often it's a passive sort of aggression. But like I said, we're very negative towards other religions that don't believe like us. Humility is the key. It will open us to God's love for others and allow us to know a wider range. God loves everyone. The same light that went through the window, the glass-stained window, this group receive a red light. It's defined by their culture, and it's received through their culture. And we need to understand that. We need to be humble about that. As our world is spiraling into nationalism, here's the thing, and imperialism, we should be aware that fear, anger, hatred, violence, all of these are becoming more normal within society.
That's true.
We didn't even, no one was shocked
Certainly should.
when more than 100 school children got killed in the bombing, which is, how long did the media talk about that, or the churches didn't even talk about that? Becoming more normal within our society. These dysfunctional emotions and actions are starting to be seen as solutions rather than problems. They have Netanyahu bombing Lebanon, displacing 500,000 people who are not terrorists. Any talk from the Christians about that? Nothing. They're seen as solutions to their problems. There's a growing danger of modern religions, including Christianity, becoming aggressive and even militant. Yeah? This behavior is opposed to the primary characteristics of God. We begin reconstructing our theology with God's love. If God were to be described in a single word, what would that word be? What is the primary characteristic of God from which all flows? So the differences in religions is based on how they see God. What is the primary characteristic? Let's give you a few examples. There's 3 words that are normally attributed to God from various religions. That's holiness, justice, and love. Typically, all of these three traits are held to be present within God's nature. The difference among religion is in which of the 3 characteristics is believed to be primary. Okay? Christians, traditional Christians, holiness is a central aspect of God, is traditional Christian. In Orthodox Christianity, for God to accept us, a sacrifice is required to satisfy God's requirements for holiness. And that's why we have this bad theology about the cross. For these Christians, God's love is secondary to holiness. Thus, God's love meets the holiness requirement by providing the needed sacrifice in Jesus. God's justice then rests upon all who do not have faith in the sacrifice. Jews, justice is the defining characteristic of God. Thus, God's love is limited to those who deserve it. We deserve it by participating in the covenant of Moses, mostly defined by obeying the law of Moses. That's how I grew up, the law of Moses. This obedience yields holiness. You don't eat this, you don't do that. That's the law of Moses. With justice is God's primary characteristic, holiness and love are conferred on those who are righteous through participation and obedience. Obedience is the key. Obey the 10 Commandments. We can see that when holiness is primary, God's love is secondary, allowing acceptance of only those who become holy. Even though the holiness is through Jesus, imputation of righteousness. It's still, holiness is primary. Justice is primary, God's love, again, secondary, is reserved for those who deserve it. So obedience, works. What do we say about God when we say love is God's defining characteristic? When love is primary, God can step away from holiness and enter into an unholy world. I love that. When love is primary, our own cry for justice becomes God's own cry for justice. And God takes our demand for justice upon God's very self, not because of our requirement for holiness, but because of love. In God's loving self-sacrifice is found true holiness in our own loving self-sacrifice, we are made holy. So you have all those. What about the paradox concerning the personhood of God? God is a person, that is true. We can have a personal relationship with God. And that relationship is seen in the ultimate experience of a personal God. At the same time, God is not a person. God is beyond the limitations of personhood and cannot be ultimately experienced as such. So there's a paradox, both true. True, one and at the same time. Changing our belief is not accomplished quickly. It requires researching topics related to our belief. It requires careful observation, trying to see what is really there. It requires us to listen to the opinion of others. And most certainly, reconsideration requires introspection, considering why we hold such beliefs. In the end, it will be worth the effort, because even if we don't change our belief, we will have a much clearer understanding of what and why we believe. Only after coming to a clear understanding of ourselves and our beliefs, we will be able to embrace a paradox without it causing anxiety. So, we will go through this process and begin next week by going back to our history. May we all benefit from this. May our faith become stronger, more clearer, more easier to share. It will make us more Christ-like and not be limited by our cultural and religious baggage.